Hi, BookTube. Welcome to another fiction review. Welcome especially to Meg at Books Off the Beaten Path, because it was because of her recommendation that I read today's title. Today we are reviewing The Red Lamp by Mary Roberts Rinehart, published in 1925, just 230 pages long. I did not check, but I think this should be available on Project Gutenberg. So the prices online are there as a reference, only the prices vary incredibly because obviously with a book this age, there are a lot of rare copies. I saw one that was signed. So the cheapest I found online in the UK was £8.50. So I took a decision because the Kindle version was the cheapest and I wanted it quickly. I couldn't find copies in the UK library system, and it's a shame because in her lifetime, Mary Roberts Rinehart outsold Agatha Christie. She is known as the American Agatha Christie for her paranormal, slightly dark Gothic mystery novels. So for those of us in the UK who are wondering, Mary Roberts Rinehart, who is that? Well, she was born in 1876 in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, and she had an unfortunate growing up and young life. Her father committed suicide the same year she graduated from Pittsburgh Training College for Nurses in 1896. She then married physician Stanley Rinehart. They had 3 sons, but Stanley Rinehart had a financial crisis when some of his investments went bad, and this was just before the First World War, and so they were in dire straits financially again. And it was at this point that Roberts Rinehart decided to try writing, and she became successful immediately. And her first publication in 1908 was The Circular Staircase. And I made this collage so you could get to know her a little bit better and recognize her. But just to give you a sense of how well she sold, Publishers Weekly, their top 10 bestseller list throughout the years, Mary Roberts Rinehart made that top 10 list in 1910, 1915, 1918, 1919, 1922, 1923, 1927, and 1930. That's how well that woman's book sold. Let's talk about the setting for The Red Lamp. All the locations mentioned in the book are either unnamed or fictional. For example, our narrator and protagonist, William Porter, he teaches at the university. That's all you know. That could be anywhere. Most of the story is spent in a community called Oakville, which we know is near the sea. Now, I used Google Maps to show me all the American Oakvilles, and I can tell you now, none of them have an ocean coastline. The time period of the novel is very precisely dated. It falls between the 16th of June and the 10th of September, 1922. Now, the narrative actually opens 2 years later, 30th of June, 1924, and that's because the narrator gets an uncomfortable reminder about his past and is forced to replay the events over again by rereading his journal. In terms of the more local setting, Mary Roberts Rinehart is drawing on a very long English literary tradition. There is a fantastic site called FutureLearn where you can pick up and take remote courses offered by real universities, and some of these are free of charge. Back in 2013, I took a course offered by the University of Sheffield called The Literature of the English Country House. It examined the works written in England between the 17th and 20th centuries, where the setting is a large country house with land surrounding it, and how the architecture of that large, isolated house, it's a perfect metaphor for the character's sense of isolation within their own mind, left with their own fears and memories. And just as the house may be full of secrets and things buried and best forgotten, well, I think you can see the psychological parallels. And this course explained that was why so many country house stories end up being Gothic or haunted. And the property that we are going to in this novel is called Twin Hollows. As soon as I saw the name, I thought Hollows, perfect. If in American minds, that is going to create Gothic associations before you even get to the property. In that way, Roberts Rinehart is really picking up on and using all the Gothic hints she can just by the setting that she creates. We'll talk about the narrative now, which is first person, and I understand from my introduction to the novel that this was typical for Mary Roberts Rinehart to use the first person. Our narrator is William Porter. He's a middle-aged university English literature professor, right? Immediately evokes mild-mannered, and you would be absolutely right with Porter, he is. This is also a framed narrative in that the story actually consists of extracts from Porter's own very meticulously kept journals. And it is a modern narrative, and by modern I mean it is post-World War I, when for a lot of writers it became very important to discard that Victorian kind of narrator who was authoritative and sure of themselves and could tell you exactly how things were. That is not the case with Mary Roberts Rinehart's narrator, William Porter. He is a little self-deprecating. He doesn't particularly think that much of himself. He thinks he's a bit of a tame man who's kept himself hidden away. This is how he describes himself. He says, "My little rut is comfortable. So long have I lain in it that now my very body has conformed. I fit my easy chair beside my reading lamp. My thumbs are broadened with much holding of books. I depend on my tea." What we get from Porter is not a charismatic folk hero type that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. This is not even a man who fought in the First World War. It sounds as though he was too old to be called up at the time. So he doesn't have any terrible haunting memories, although he knows men who may have. He submits to us just his ordinary everyday record keeping as evidence of what happened to him. And this contrasts with Agatha Christie mysteries, which were being written at the same time. Agatha Christie's novels, as we all will know if we've even read one of them, they are less realistic, third-person narratives, and they follow that Victorian idea of the narrator knows best and they're going to tell you how it is, right? And then we also have an investigator who is kind of a charismatic, romantic folk hero who has this extraordinary ability to get everything right with little or no assistance and is always a reliable source of authority. That is not how Mary Roberts Rinehart chooses to style her protagonists, and that makes her a more realistic, modern novelist. Let's talk about characters. First of all, numbers. We are in the 15 to 25 range in terms of numbers. You need enough people to provide suspects, red herrings, law enforcement, victims, of course. I won't comment on how many of these characters might be alive or dead. That is part of the novel's mystery, but you will mostly read about the same four very much alive people: William Porter, his wife Jane, his niece Edith, and her love interest, Warren Halliday. In terms of mobility, because we're always with our protagonist and his journal entry, so it's what he experienced at the time, he's a little like Richard Papin in Donna Tartt's The Secret History, because she chose to have a first-person narrator who had limited mobility, and William does for different reasons throughout the story. That's a great device to maintain suspense, because Porter, he's always waiting to find things out, and he often has to find things out second or third hand because he wasn't able to be there himself. Now, in terms of representation, I just wanted to mention there is one character, Clara, who is the cook for Mr. and Mrs. Porter. She may be black, it is not stated, but then it wouldn't necessarily be, but there's a good chance that she was. And I think one thing that is important to remember about this book is that it is a series of journal entries, and it's easy to forget that as a reader. And Porter writes these for himself, doesn't he? And therefore, he's not going to make the kind of repetitions or explanations that an ordinary traditional narrator might if they were composing a fresh account with other readers in mind, right? Certain minor characters might be mentioned once and then not be mentioned again for a long time. And when they're mentioned again, there'll be no reminder of who they were. That is the nature of journal entries. And I really admired the fact that Mary Roberts Rinehart was very careful to stick to that. She did not make any error that I could find in the narrative where she slipped up and wrote something as a journal entry that I could immediately go, no, that wouldn't have been written in a journal entry. She stayed very true to that. And that also keeps you, the reader, a little bit confused because the writer of the journal is a little bit confused at the time he's writing. Talk about the content now. Problematic content. Well, this is a 1920s novel. So there would be no need for readers to even ask whether a book would contain sexually explicit content, profanity, or explicit violence, because it would have been very, very, very difficult to get a book published in the 1920s in America if it contained any of that. But one word regarding the mystery of the book, because there is more than one mystery that needs to be solved. And I can't say more for obvious reasons, but the situation where you have multiple mysteries means that although you get lots of information from William Porter, you don't know exactly which mystery it applies to or which question in that particular mystery it's solving. So you, the reader, will not be able to guess who done it. And I think you should be careful if you come to a Mary Roberts Rinehart book. Do not have that expectation, because you'll find it frustrating. The narrator devotes a long journal entry at the end of the novel to explaining what can be explained about one of the mysteries. So he ties that up very tidily, something kind of similar to Agatha Christie's drawing room scenes, but it doesn't answer every question. The ending still remains a little bit open, and you must understand that made complete sense for the publication year of 1925, when the memory of all the senseless loss of life in World War I, it created a feeling among writers that to do anything that tried to answer every question and nail everything down was almost an insult to the unanswered questions that were left after the war. Now, Agatha Christie wasn't one of those writers. She was able to carry on with that sort of authoritative narrator. And so you mustn't come to Mary Roberts Rinehart expecting something like Agatha Christie. You will get something slightly different. And let's talk about some of the other differences. Agatha Christie mysteries, they're always completely solved, aren't they, by a single investigator who's got unusual ability, kind of a romantic folk hero, as I've mentioned before. In the introduction to my edition of The Red Lamp, it was written by Otto Penzler, and he notes that Mary Roberts Rinehart doesn't create folk heroes. Her protagonists are very ordinary people, right? They're prone to bad timing, emotional decisions. In the case of The Red Lamp, they're clearly assisted by a lot of other people. So the solving of the mystery is a communal effort. Now, Otto Penzler was asking himself in this introduction, why have Christie's works remained so popular after her death, whereas Mary Roberts Rinehart's, her book sales fell off very quickly after she died? And he believes the folk hero is one reason that, it's the reason that we still tell stories about Sherlock Holmes and Robin Hood. And I would also add that Mary Roberts Rinehart, her first person narrators, with all their foibles, I think they belong better on the page. I think they would be difficult to recreate effectively and dramatically on screen. They are not dramatic people. The Red Lamp would be tricky to dramatize. And I think it could only be done by altering the viewpoint or recreating scenes which the book's narrator never experienced firsthand, but only heard about. For my rabbit hole section, I'd like to read an extract from this book just to give you a sense of the kind of prose that Mary Roberts Rinehart wrote. I loved it. I thought there was an elegance to it and also a consciousness of different literary forms. So I'm going to be reading to you from page 10 of my Kindle edition. Commencement week is over at last, thank heaven, and with no more than the usual casualties, defeated at the ball game 9-6, Lear down with Ptomaine, result of bad ice cream somewhere or other, usual reunions of old boys with porters staggering under the suitcases which seem to grow heavier each year. Nevertheless, the very old uns always give me a lump in the throat, and I fancy there was a considerable amount of globus hystericus as Uncle Horace's class marched onto the field on class day. Only 8 of them this year, Uncle Horace being missing, poor old boy. Which reminds me that Jane thought she saw him with the others as they marched in. Wonderful woman, Jane. No imagination ordinarily, meticulous mind and only a faint sense of humour. Yet she drags poor old Horace out of his year-old grave and marches him on to the field, and then becomes slightly sulky with me when I laugh. I told you to bring your glasses, my dear, I said. How many men are in that group? She demanded tersely. 8, and for heaven's sake, lower your voice. I see 9, William, she said quietly, and when she stood up to take her usual snapshots of the alumni procession, she was trembling. A curious woman, Jane. So, another year is over, and what have I to show for it? A small addition to my account in the savings bank, a volume or two of this uneventful diary, some hundreds of men who perhaps know the Cavalier poets and perhaps not, and some few who now have an inkling that English literature did not begin with Shakespeare. What have I to look forward to? 3 months of uneventful summering, perhaps at Twin Hollows, if Larkin ever gets the estate settled, and then the old round again. Milton and Dryden and Pope, Addison and Swift. Elegant was the word that just came to my mind again and again as I was reading through The Red Lamp. I need to explain what I mean when I think his prose is elegant. The passage is written as William Porter might speak, that is, there is the occasional fragment to remind you this is just a person's ordinary vernacular voice. However, where the prose is in complete sentences, then you get some interesting thing. The word choices are mostly straightforward. You don't have any trouble with them. Now and again, Rinehart just inserts a couple of academic terms just to remind you who is William Porter. He is a teacher of English literature, so he's going to know a little bit of vocabulary, but she doesn't overload you with the vocabulary he might know. The sentence length also is nicely varied. You get a variety of sentence lengths. There's only one sentence in that whole passage I read that's more than 4 lines long, and it's that wry listing of what the narrator has to look forward to. And there are noticeable rhythms to some sentences, almost like they make you think of poetry, or at least I could read them that way. What have I to look forward to? If you read that in iambic, it's what have I to look forward to? And then you get Milton and Dryden and Pope. Lovely little bits like that, which just, it just shows so much care and attention to how the sentences are put together, what words are chosen. And I really appreciated this writing. I thought it was very good. And given that the next novel that I read was Matthew Pearl, which I'm going to talk about later, what a difference between those two writers and the way they construct their sentences and paragraphs. And that's the review done. Meg, I want to thank you so much for introducing me to this author. She has astounding ability. I was just so blown away by the writing. I love to reread it again and again. I see why you reread this book over and over. There's something very compellingly beautiful about the writing. In fact, I enjoyed it so much that what I did just a couple of days ago was treat myself to a Kindle version of Mary Roberts Rinehart's complete work so I can read some of the other novels that you've mentioned as well. That's it, everybody. I don't really have much in the description box today. Thank you so much for joining me. Look forward to seeing you again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.